Welcome to Philosophy of Value Workshops number 32 of series 10. The question for today is, what is wrong with applied philosophy and what should we do about it? Reading from one of my works, The Pursuit of Value, chapter 1, section 9. Now, today I want to talk about a new way of understanding human existence and human experience as consciousness. Of course, in the modern world, new ways of understanding are coming into play all the time, yet they are often not taken up because they are invalid or because there isn't a suitable context of ideas ready to receive them, or because they are providing answers to questions that are not being asked. I want to firstly briefly outline some of these issues with respect to consciousness as the key concept in today's topic. We have seen that there is a great misunderstanding about the idea of consciousness, and there are many internal and external reasons for this misunderstanding. We have previously discussed many of these, and I don't want to go over them again today. But I want to reiterate that consciousness is an integrative concept that gathers together primary human experiences, and it gives focus to human subjectivity as well as representing the question of human existence. It is thereby a key concept in finding a comprehensive answer to this question. But as Ty Nguyen explains, such concepts can unexpectedly be too explicit and too focused, and they thereby leave out the background of understanding in which they need to be understood. This excessive focus has been a problem for both of my key concepts of consciousness and value. That is, when I use them, they narrow the context of understanding in which I am talking, but I wouldn't be understood at all if I didn't employ them. Another problem here is presupposing the initial question from which we are working, and the diversity of philosophical issues magnifies the multiplicity of possible starting points. These include the pursuit of knowledge, human well-being, ethics, and many others. Yet the initial question that I would like to distinguish here isn't the same as these and many other questions. I'm asking questions about the most fundamental level of human existence and consciousness, and these aren't the same as questions about knowledge, ethics, or psychology. Although, of course, these questions are related to questions of consciousness. But to understand what these questions of consciousness are, we must return to the underlying question, what is consciousness? I'm not going to answer this question again here, as we discussed this last week, but I can briefly reiterate my position and review how the problem of consciousness has arisen. My account is of an interactionist theory of mind and a structural conception of consciousness as a process in time and a relation both with itself and with its objects. But the fact that understanding consciousness is a problem can be seen in a brief review of its history. One early obfuscation of consciousness is found in the religious notion of soul or spirit. Ancient Greek thought might be assumed not to be subject to this neglect, but this isn't the case. Reviewing a number of articles on Aristotle's philosophy of mind, the researcher W.F.R. Hardy found that Aristotle had no concept of consciousness, or not one corresponding closely to ours. And Hilary Putnam agrees with Hardy on the late discovery of mind. He said that what we call the mind is really a fairly late construction, in fact no earlier than Descartes, unquote, and that Aristotle's explanation of the mind, or psyche, is of the whole organized living body that includes digestion and reproduction. Yet the evidence shows that this neglect of consciousness has continued into the modern world. Thomas Natsoulas, for example, tells us that the word consciousness first appeared in print in 1681 with John Locke, And today, some people falsely attribute phenomenal consciousness to AI. Some also believe that they can be immortal by making clones of themselves. And just 100 years ago, Edmund Husserl stated that what we lack above all is a certain general insight into the essence of consciousness in general, unquote. David Chalmers has more recently said that we are entirely in the dark about how consciousness fits into the natural order. And Bernard Williams also talks about a pervasive obscurity in our idea of consciousness. My underlying point here is that the neglect and obfuscation of consciousness is a part of a wider and deeper lack of awareness of the subjectivity of human existence. As previously discussed, much of this problem can be traced back to Renaissance and Enlightenment thinking, that although progressive, it called for rational thought and empirical evidence that requires careful application to the study of mind or consciousness. But such care wasn't always taken, as seen in its influence on later philosophy, and this has had an adverse effect on our understanding of consciousness. In the 19th century, for example, Auguste Comte advocated positivism as a method for the social sciences. Positivism is the view that only hard facts count, and Comte regarded sociology as a form of social physics. Comte's positivism led to the subsequent philosophy of logical positivism of the Vienna Circle, made up of people like Maurice Schlick, Ernst Mach and Rudolf Carnap. Logical positivism is a rationalist and materialist view that held that value judgments are senseless because they lack cognitive content. And in 1931, Carnap wrote the paper Psychology in the Language of Physics, which further indicates his view. More specifically, he said that psychology is to be degraded into a part of physics, unquote. The physicalist implications here for understanding mind or consciousness are unmistakable. Yet both Renaissance thinking and logical positivism also had an influence on analytic philosophy. This can be seen in the work of A.J. Ayer, Gilbert Ryle and many others. And we have seen that analytic philosophy has adopted many of these features as well as those of science. That is, analytic philosophy emphasizes evidence, verification and precision in logic and language. And science has also sought objectivity by removing the observing consciousness from the picture. And a preference for physicalism can consequently also be found in analytic philosophy. So positivism in philosophy is the first part of the problem that I'm working towards here. That is, the methods that work in physics for physical objects are not suitable for understanding consciousness. Unlike physical objects, mind is amorphous, directly unobservable, graduated and unquantifiable. It isn't like quantifiable matter subject to empirical observations and overt relations. One solution to the problem of finding a philosophy of mind is often thought to be found in phenomenology. Yet we must first ask here, why can't psychology take on this role alongside the philosophy of mind? And to answer, we can take up the new distinction between mind and consciousness. It is a new distinction because it is only made in modern thought. And this novelty supports the point of this study about a new way of understanding. Now, mind can be understood as a general category that can include the unconscious, genetics, neurology, and perhaps animal minds, as well as consciousness. And psychology can also be regarded as a study of mind, whereas phenomenology is a more specific examination of consciousness. To clarify the distinction, we can outline different aspects or branches of psychology like neurology, genetics, biology, behaviorism, and functionalism. Yet either mind or consciousness can only be understood indirectly through these activities. Neurology, for example, can tell us so much about the mind and human behavior, but it is also very limited. Some of these limitations are probably temporary, but it can never tell us what consciousness is. This is because neural events are preconditions of consciousness, not consciousness itself. To deal with consciousness itself, we need principles and structures of consciousness. And this is what phenomenology claims to offer. The same thing can be said about genetics, biology, behaviorism, and functionalism. That is, they tell us much about the mind and human behavior, but they don't tell us about what kind of phenomenon the mind is or its underlying principles. Yet this may be making assumptions about what understanding mind means, except we'll shortly see another standard of understanding set by phenomenology. Yet there is another way of assessing psychology, in that it does deal with real mental issues like projection, transference, neurosis, psychosis, schizophrenia, autism, anxiety, depression, and PTSD. But these are symptoms, and their causes, as maladies, are complex, and their resolutions are practical, which is another difference with a phenomenological analysis of consciousness. That is, phenomenology attempts to understand consciousness as a distinct phenomenon. Yet another claim about what mind is goes back to early psychologists like Wilhelm Wundt, Titchener, and Freud. Freud offered structures of mind with an infantile id, an executive ego, and the conscience of a superego. Wilhelm Wundt and Edward Titchener proposed the then unpopular idea of a divisible mind, and they employed introspection as a kind of phenomenological method of examination. Yet phenomenology takes these ideas further into the new domain of consciousness. This is a domain taken further by thinkers like Brentano, Husserl, Heidegger, and Sartre. Husserl and Heidegger expanded Descartes' cogito with the life world and being in the world, respectively, as well as with the development of the idea of structures of consciousness. Yet Franz Brentano introduced intentionality as a basic structure of consciousness in his book significantly entitled Psychology from an Empirical Standpoint. Yet Edmund Husserl is considered the founder of phenomenology as a descriptive account of consciousness, and he attributed it with monumental significance as the discovery of a new sphere of being, unquote. This followed from his view that Descartes opened the door of consciousness but failed to enter. And he underlined all this in saying that whoever misunderstands the phenomenological reduction is lost. Husserl's phenomenological reduction is, of course, a separating out of consciousness from other matters. But Heidegger, Merleau-Ponty and others believed that a complete reduction wasn't possible. Yet, as a novel recognition of consciousness, Dan Zahavi, Joel Smith and others believe that we should look at it again, and it is certainly indicated by the neglect and misunderstanding of consciousness that we have seen. In particular, the idea of structures of consciousness is embraced by all phenomenologists, including Heidegger, Sartre and Merleau-Ponty, and it is the idea of structures of consciousness, compelling evidence for them and their significance of human life, that we must examine now as a new way of understanding human existence as consciousness. A basic argument for structures of consciousness is that 1. Consciousness exists, 2. Therefore it must have properties, and 3. Those properties are best described as structures. But the idea that consciousness must have properties is invariably overlooked. Yet in these outlines below, I want to emphasize both the prodigy and the limitations of structures of consciousness. That is, we need to understand much more about their application in order to understand what their potential can be. To start with Brentano's original concept of intentionality, the concept of intentionality is now accepted or used by practically all schools of philosophy, and it is underpinned by the compelling idea that consciousness is always conscious of something. Yet for Husserl and Heidegger, it is a relation between the interiority of consciousness and its exteriority that they described as directedness towards its objects. And particularly in Heidegger's Being in the World, intentionality helped to overcome Cartesian dualism. Yet the questions about the quality of intentionality and its choices led to the moral principle of authenticity. And intentionality, choice and authenticity also led to the existentialist principle of freedom. Freedom and choice were further emphasized by Sartre's idea of consciousness as nothingness. On this view, consciousness has to continuously reconstitute itself by free, authentic choices. In addition to their intuitive and practical appeal, this is how freedom and authenticity became existentialist ideals. But they have been severely criticized. It is uncertain, for example, how freedom can provide moral guidance. Sartre claimed that we should protect the freedom of others, but this injunction has limited application. Authenticity has also been criticized as having only personal but not social application. The further existentialist idea of responsibility is also limited in that it refers back and relies upon other principles that are either defective or unnamed. The point here is that intentionality is a significant property and a means of defining consciousness, and that choice, freedom and authenticity are significant features of human life. But intentionality has so far been of uncertain usefulness in directing human action. That is, and this is something that needs to be rectified. Temporality is the second structure of consciousness most commonly cited in phenomenology and existentialism. Heidegger emphasized temporality and time as the horizon of being, and Husserl had similarly spoken of the flow of consciousness and the flow of becoming, in which every experience has necessarily been preceded in time by experiences. There is here the notion of time as an essential feature of consciousness as an ongoing process. We not only find ourselves in a world of time or temporality, but time is a constituent of consciousness. And we also find ourselves in a world of not only diversity, selection and choice, but also of time. That is, consciousness is moving through time as well as through the diversity of space in time. William James had, of course, previously described consciousness as a stream or river in a continual flow, and these insights led to consciousness being understood in a new way. But this new understanding has not led directly to much needed new theories of action or ethics, except that temporality has played some part in ethics in accounting for past actions. In order to bring out the potential of temporality in guiding human action, I will first discuss divisibility as another structure of consciousness that explains this potential. But I should first explain that divisibility isn't a standard structure in phenomenology. That is, like others, such as intentionality, temporality, and intersubjectivity. Yet John Searle suggests unity as a structure of consciousness that is the opposite of divisibility. To give myself latitude here, I can note that Sartre unrestrainedly names a multiplicity of features as structures. These include freedom, choice, presence, facticity, value, possibility, negation, and finitude. But I regard most of these as properties or features rather than structures, because they aren't all internal to consciousness or give it shape or form. In my view, divisibility is a structure applicable to the whole spectrum of human life, from the initial contrasts required by cognition and value to the separateness of individual people. We should note that for Schopenhauer, Feuerbach and Vedanta, consciousness isn't an individual property. On this outdated view, individuals only participate in a universal consciousness. Yet at this level, separateness between individuals can be described as the structure of insularity. And as I have previously discussed, insularity explains a number of things, including the sense of the uncanny in our lives. But more relevantly here, divisibility includes split brains, faux modular minds, fission, cognitive diversity, and the fundamental contrasts at the origins of consciousness that give rise to perception and value. This is illustrated by the idea that a white spot on a white board can't be seen. It needs a contrast. And such contrasts and divisions in the world are mirrored in the origins of value. Yet the origins of value in divisibility and its coexistence with consciousness is best explained by phenomenology. Heidegger, for example, cites care as the being of Dasein, and Sartre writes that the being of the self is value. He goes on to say that choice and consciousness are one and the same thing, and that every choice supposes elimination and selection, thereby producing value. That is, elimination and selection presuppose preference, which is an expression of value. Sartre also writes, choice isn't just preference, but a selection traced back to its ontological foundation. But Sartre can't actually trace selection, choice and value back to their ontological foundation. This is because his ultra-phenomenological analysis cannot include pre-conscious or unconscious events. Yet we can do this with a structure of graduation that I will outline shortly. So the divisibility and graduation of consciousness enable us to trace the origins of value back to its emergence. And we can continue to say that contrast and selection are expressions of choice that produce value. For example, when I look left or right, I affirm what is on my right and negate what is on my left. This phenomenological analysis already partly answers the question of where the values come from. Of course, values also originate from genetics and social conventions, as well as from qualified choices. But philosophy has long been in the dark about the ontological genealogy of value and values. This lack of understanding is often reflected in religious arguments for God, when they say that God is needed to produce values because atoms and molecules don't provide values. They are correct in their latter view, but fail to understand that consciousness produces values. But the above are just nascent values, not the values that we need in motivation, morals, meaning or purpose. That is to be expected when explaining the origins of value. Yet we can return to Husserl's and Heidegger's concept of temporality to take the explanation further. That is, we find ourselves in a world of time or temporality, as well as diversity, divisibility, selection and choice. The diversity of the world demands selections and choices that produce value. Yet consciousness is also moving through time as well as through diversity in space, and substantive values must be continually produced to cope with the flow of existence. But there are still problems of priority and justification of value and values to be resolved. And to establish a priority of value, we can't avoid constraints such as posed by Hume and More. I resolve this problem in the form of a value theory ethics based on a fundamental will to value. That is, an inherent will to value that can be subsequently chosen as a moral principle. I've explained and argued for a value theory ethics in my writings and other podcasts. Yet I've indicated above how a will to value can be established on a phenomenology of consciousness. That is, in addition to empirical evidence of a will to value in such forms as ineradicable drives for self-esteem, meaning, purpose, and moral justification. These outcomes about value and ethics go beyond standard claims and standard structures in phenomenology, like intentionality and temporality, to include divisibility, insularity, and graduation, to which I can now add insubstantiality in explanation of the problem of human existence. Yet we must first give a brief outline of graduation as a structure of consciousness. Graduation is the seemingly obvious property that consciousness can and does exist in degrees. That is, as observed in species and personal development, as well as in the valence of mental states. I've argued for the graduation of consciousness elsewhere, and I can't repeat it here. But some who agree with this view are Darwin, Bernard Williams, Jean Piaget, H. Price, John Eccles, and Teilhard de Chardin. Sartre, Colin McGinn, and Tim Bain disagree with graduation for reasons that I argue against. Yet the structures of temporality, divisibility, graduation, and insularity explain the general problem of insubstantiality. That is, temporality produces impermanence, change, choice, responsibility, and anxiety. Divisibility creates problems like personal fragmentation, internal conflicts, and alienation. Graduation means that we not only develop, but also diminish and eventually die. And insularity, it describes our isolation and the difficulty of apprehending ourselves. That is, I can't apprehend myself by reference to objects of the same kind as myself. Yet I also want to explain the property or structure of insubstantiality by comparison and contrast to Sartre's ideas. Sartre describes such a condition as a relation between conscious being for itself and physical being in itself. On this view, physicality has impregnable being which cannot be deformed, reduced, or threatened. Yet a contingent and ephemeral consciousness seeks the permanent in itself of physicality. But this project is impossible, hence Sartre describes mankind as a useless passion. Yet we need not accept Sartre's aspirations of consciousness as those of substantive physical properties. This is because we can replace his substantive physical properties with substantive value properties. That is, I replace his aspirations for physical properties with a will to value, and I replace his physical properties with a more realistic objective of value sufficiency. And we can do all this with the value theories suggested here and laid out elsewhere. Yet to do this, we need to not only adopt many of the ideas provided by phenomenology, but also we need to go beyond them. That is, we need to explain how and why structures are existentially significant for lived human existence. It's because these structures aren't just abstract features, but represent relations and states of consciousness. Structures are the frameworks or vessels which extrude mental states, and those mental states are supervenient on, and that is the right word, structures of consciousness. That is, structures are the vehicles or crucibles of cognition, affect, feeling, will and value. They contour our character, how we experience ourselves, and our concerns about what we are. So on this view, structures aren't just concepts with which to understand consciousness. They are also the fabric of consciousness, which constitutes the character of our thoughts, feelings and values. And as I have argued previously, problems must be resolved in terms of affect, feeling and value. Cognition, affect, will and even consciousness itself can't ultimately resolve the problems of consciousness. The solution must be found in terms of value, that is, a sufficiency or sufficiencies of value. These are sufficiencies of value like love, self-esteem and other undiscovered value states. But there are questions to be asked here, such as how can an ontological problem of existence be resolved in terms of value? And even Sartre states that ontology itself cannot formulate ethical precepts. But I have a simple answer that introduces the idea of problems of existence being resolved in terms of value. That is, let's say you lose $50. You can either resolve the problem by being reimbursed or by coming to terms with this loss, with the benefits and consolations of that outcome. Yet this raises the question of how can value be the kind of thing that can do this? One common objection is that value is an abstract concept without any substantive existence. But value is a general or collective term that represents particular values that do have substantive existence. And values can be actions like wanting or liking, or they're objects like money or truth. Yet values can also be states like love, hate, worship, resentment, respect or distaste. And this is why I've had to coin the term value states. So with these principles, we have all the requirements for a theory of human existence that goes beyond standard phenomenological concepts and structures. And we can do this by using the concepts of value, the will to value, and a sufficiency of value that are expressed in ethics, meaning, purpose, and in a life well lived, as well as in a new understanding of consciousness. My conclusion is that although phenomenology has brought about a new understanding of consciousness through an appreciation that it is the kind of thing that can have both form and structure, the standard structures can be extended both in their scope and in their practical expression in human action. And that even though Husserl's life world and Heidegger's being in the world extended our philosophical appreciation of consciousness, this appreciation needs to be realized in both professional philosophy and in the public domain. One example of extending the scope of structures was done by using divisibility and temporality in an explanation of the origins and ontological genealogy of values and value. The will to value leading to a sufficiency of value, together with a value theory ethics, was then cited as a means of guiding moral action and other human experiences. And the new understanding of consciousness as an integrative concept that made all this possible can also be understood as an amalgam of the four states of cognition, affect, will and value, of which value is the realm in which morals, meaning and purpose and aesthetics are located. Yet understanding or appreciating consciousness as the basis of human subjectivity and the realm of value isn't just a matter of having the right ideas, because consciousness constitutes what we are, and being less conscious, like animals are typically less conscious than humans, diminishes and obfuscates the very phenomenon of consciousness that we are trying to apprehend. So let me have your comments or criticisms at the meeting or on websites like Zoom or meetup.com. The kind of responses that I'm looking for are either approbation or criticisms explaining where I have gone wrong.